Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Silver Years. My name is DK, and I'm very happy to be here, and I humbly thank you for joining me. Today is a new segment of My Story Time. Now, My Story Time is where I tell stories from my life as I experience them, stories that make up my story, not his story, stories that are unique, authentic, to me and my experiences. And these stories are a part of my legacy and the genetic imprints that I leave to my future generations, who, by the way, don't even really know about these stories because they just never came up. Overall, these stories probably only have meaning to me, but hopefully you will find something useful in them as well. Or not. I'm going to tell them anyway, for the record. The story that wants to be told today is coming in from 1985 and begins in Denver, Colorado. And this is kind of a continuation of the Swimming with the Fishes video that I did about Gary Johnson. I kind of touched on this company and my role within it. But it was a very large mortgage company. Like I said, it was located in a 3-story with a basement 4-story building off of Spear Boulevard. The company is no longer around. It hasn't been around for a very long time. It was a very large company, and they had an origination department that did residential. So they did a lot of home loans. The third floor was the servicing department, and part of it was the commercial department too. They had a small commercial division where they originated commercial mortgage loans on commercial property in the area, and they represented lenders who were out of state. So we had banks from different states, we had small life insurance companies, things like that. We were not like a really big commercial lender. Commercial loans go in niches. So if you're looking from 500,000 to maybe 5 million or even 2 million, that would be a niche. Anything above 5 million, you might have lenders who do 5 to 10 million, and then you have the big lenders who might go way above that. But during this time in 1985, it was just hitting the end of this big boom period where things were growing. It was very expansive. Everybody wanted to jump in. All these lenders wanted their hands in the boom market tied to commercial real estate. And it was the same with the residential too, but my focus was on commercial. So when I was hired by this company, they brought me in to service their commercial loans. Now, servicing is the role you play after the loan's closed. And what the servicing department is required to do is, of course, process all the payments and everything, but you're also required to monitor the things that are necessary to keep the loan functioning. A lot of these commercial loans were adjustable rates. So somebody had to keep track of when they needed to adjust and how they needed to adjust, and to notify the borrowers of when they adjusted and how their payments would be impacted. So adjustment periods were necessary, monitoring insurance coverage and making sure insurance policies were always in force and effective at every time. It was way more than just collecting a payment and making sure a payment is posted. It was also making sure the taxes were paid and any other premiums that were associated with the real estate were paid or handled so that you had evidence of it. So there was a lot that each file demanded. And each commercial file, unlike residential, there's a lot of they were all the same with residential. But with commercial, they are not the same. Each loan was different. The terms of each loan was different. The properties were underwritten differently. It just depended on who had what. So there was a lot of customization tied to commercial, and still is. Probably I'm no longer active in those arenas, and that's fine, but there's a lot of customization in those arenas. So my job was to come in, and this was a department that had been neglected. Nobody had touched it. Was just barely being managed. They would send in a residential servicer to process payments, and that was about the extent of it. So they needed somebody to come in and really dive in. So one of the roles I was given was, and computing was pretty new. Okay, we had access to DOS computers, and we used it. It was okay for certain kinds of bookkeeping. But as far as keeping track of the records for each file, they had like a little index card holder, and you had to go by cards in a tickler system, they called it. And so one of the jobs that they wanted was to computerize the tickler system so that we could have manage from a computer perspective due dates and payment dates and whatever. So I ended up having to work directly with the tech department, which was down in the basement, to create a database for the tickler system, which I did do. But in order to do that, I had to become familiar with each particular loan file we had. And I had, 3 or 4 huge file cabinets with 4 drawers, filled with these loan files. So there were a lot of files, there were a lot of accounts, and I had to get to know each and every account in order to create this database as a tickler system, which I did do. Okay. And then the markets, of course, in this, somewhere in the middle of this, the markets started to turn, the oil crisis, the energy crisis, all of that. So then commercial was starting to take hits. We started having troubled loans where payments weren't being made. But in the midst of all this, the company sort of did a housekeeping. They cleaned out some of who was in the commercial origination department, which was on the other side of the floor that I worked in. And they brought in a new guy named Howard to head up this department. They pretty much cleared out the originators, and they brought in a secretary for him who was not suited. She was more drama driven, and she was from New York, and she really had a lot of that East Coast ability to complain, and she was not suited to who he was. And they had brought him in from Steamboat Springs. He was a contractor out in Steamboat Springs. So, but he had all the banking background, but he got into building when he was in Steamboat Springs. So he was familiar with the bones of a property, which you would think that wouldn't be so important, but it is. It's important to know. So his knowledge was very important and useful. So they bring him in, but he was he didn't have a real high opinion of the female. He had a problem with women overall. And here he was stuck with this secretary that made him crazy. And the secretary was always in my space complaining to me and talking to me all the time. And I was helping her with information because, of course, I knew everything given my role. So he eventually figured it out. But before that, he had already pissed me off. He had already made me not care for him and how he acted towards me and the assumptions that he made. And there came a point when he decided he had to get rid of this secretary, and he wanted me to come over to help him. And so the woman who had up the HR department approached me. Well, first I had my supervisor approach me, and I said, absolutely not. I will not sit down and talk to that person. He doesn't treat me like a human. I don't know, not going to happen. And then the HR department started pressuring me. And this, I probably had 4 times maybe I was approached. And my supervisor again, hey, maybe she'll get me on a good day. And she said, he wants to talk to you. Will you just sit down and talk to him? And finally that day I said, okay, I will. And they were like, oh, okay, great. So they threw together this meeting, and the HR woman sat with us in between us, and he and I met in this small conference room and had it out. And I said what I needed to say loudly, and he said what he needed to say. And this poor HR person was like, "Oh my God, you two have the strongest personalities." And she did not think it was a good idea. Okay, the HR person was not on board with me transferring into that department to work with him because she did not think it was a good idea given our personalities. But I'll tell you what, I told him what I thought about him and his opinion towards women, and that I wasn't going to stand for it. And he told me how he felt about his scenario and what he felt that I could do for him. And I said, "You might learn something from me." Well, he was figuring it out because he realized ultimately that I was the only one in the building who knew everything. So he had to do what he could to bring me over, which he did. Now, we ultimately developed a very nice level of respect, and we worked well together because for a long time it was just the two of us. So here we were in this building working, and trying to work out scenarios. So basically we were working out everything, and it ended up working out okay. But a side note, working for this company, and many of you may remember or not, but the United Way, okay, that big charity, the United Way. Now, for my perspective, I have a huge problem with charities, organized charities. If I'm going to help somebody, I'm just going to quietly help somebody. I'm not going to give my resources to a company to facilitate charity I might want to uh, initiate, because they're just it's just theft. You've got administrative costs that far exceed any benefits that are ever paid out. And the United Way was notorious for this. But what they would do is they'd go into these corporations, they'd go into these companies and demand that every employee contribute out of their paycheck, every paycheck, to the United Way. And their goals were to drive 100% participation. They wanted 100% participation in these chair from every employee, okay? And companies would get big ribbons and awards and plaques and all these things for getting all of their employees to donate to the United Way. Well, of course, here I come to this company and they want me to donate to the United Way. And I said, absolutely not. So I was the holdout, that one that wouldn't do it. So how they tried to bully me into doing it, actually, because I was putting egg on their face. I was making them look bad. I wasn't giving them their 100% participation, and I don't care if it was even $5. I don't care. Not even $1 was too much for me to give out of my resources to something I didn't believe in, and knew that it would not go to the place that it was targeted to assist. So they put me on a panel in front of a whole group to explain and I was on the panel with a few people, and I think even Howard was sitting next to me. There were a number of us, and basically it was like a question and answer for those in the company to be able to find out what we do and how we do it, because we were kind of isolated. The commercial division was kind of isolated, as the company's bulk was more residential. So so then I had somebody in the back, okay, a manager in the back, who chimed up and demanded to know why I wouldn't contribute to the United Way, something that had absolutely nothing to do with why I was there on that panel. But this person's target objective was to shame and embarrass me. And I just looked at him and said, my number one charity is me and my family. They get covered first. I'm not going to pay into a system that covers administrative costs and it doesn't go to the objective that it claims to be for. I said, I will not participate. And everybody just looked at me and the subject was dropped. But in the end, the company, and they always had and the company did have a problem with it because I was the only one who wouldn't participate. But after I did that, of course, then there were others who got the courage to stand up and say no. And that part of it, I'm really glad that that happened. But in this particular company, after um, the company ultimately dissolved the commercial division. The company ultimately dissolved, period. But it was a number of years before the residential dissolved itself. But the commercial, they did dissolve it. So because all of our properties were needing to be managed because a lot of it was troubled. So what Howard and I did, we were approached by one of our bank investors who was in California to start a branch of them to handle asset management solely. So we handled their assets, and then we took on a lot of the other assets that we were managing at the bigger company. And so we manage these assets. That means the foreclosure, just everything, trying to release it, trying to, and some of these assets we managed were, um, wow. One of them was a big building in North Downtown Denver, and it housed the architecture department for Curtis Fentress. It was where they built the models, actually. And this is when Denver International Airport, when DIA was they announced the plans to do it, but Fentress was the architect who did the design. Okay, all those hideous, horrible tent things that they have, that I said first thing, the first hailstorm was going to damage those, and it did. It was, I think that the design is horrible. Stapleton was a wonderful airport. Not that there, there were a lot of other reasons why that airport was moved out to where it was, and at the time it was not necessary. But we had the office building where Fentress kept his um, model building department, and I got to see these things before it was ever built or put into physical form. They had it all designed. So there were some really interesting experiences. I mean, Howard and I would go out and do property inspections regularly, and investigate the health and well-being of the structures and things like that, all of the stuff. And we'd have to post notices when foreclosing on apartment buildings, and just every kind of thing. It got to be, uh, you're always dealing with the worst side of people when things turn bad, and it got to be really old. But suffice to say, I ended up Howard and I ended up creating this new operation, and it only lasted a couple years because we worked ourselves out of a job. We managed the assets, everything, everybody, all the lenders were comfortable, and then we just sort of dissolved everything altogether. So, in conclusion, and for whatever it's worth, this is my little protest against history, his story. This is me telling my story my way, for the record. It's my story, and I'm sticking to it. And I would love to hear your stories as well. So please feel free to share your stories in the comments. Until next time, be well, choose love, and thank you for listening. Goodbye for now.